It was the first chilly weekend of October when Ethan Miller found himself staring at the neon glow of a cheap roadside motel in Queens, his life reduced to 4 duffel bags and a box of mismatched mugs. Just 2 weeks earlier, he'd been living what most would call a fairly stable New York City existence. Steady IT job, cozy, if overpriced, 1-bedroom near Prospect Park, and a 3-year relationship that in retrospect had been quietly decaying for months. The breakup itself was a hurricane of accusations, tears, and one spectacular fight over a chipped Le Creuset pan. By the time the dust settled, the only thing Ethan was certain of was that he needed to get out. Moving day was a blur of cardboard U-Hauls and the awkward dance of dividing lives. Now left in the harsh fluorescent silence of a motel room, Ethan had to confront the question that hovers over so many New Yorkers at the end of a relationship. Where the hell am I going to live next? For the first week, he told himself he'd never settle. He scrolled through apartment listings every night, thumbing past the endless parade of Craigslist horrors. Windowless basements advertised as garden units. Closet-sized studios with astronomical rent and living rooms converted into private sanctuaries by nothing more than a curtain and wishful thinking. Ethan stubbornly filtered out any ad with the word roommate, remembering all too well the disasters his friends had suffered, roommates who stole packages, never cleaned, or brought home a rotating cast of strangers. But as the days dragged on, and the motel bills stacked up nearly $80 a night, not counting the soggy breakfast bagels, the math was simple and ruthless. He was hemorrhaging cash, and the city didn't care how heartbreakingly vulnerable he felt. New York demanded adaptation, or it chewed you up. After 2 weeks and $1,000 gone, Ethan's resolve weakened. He began to consider the unthinkable. Maybe living with a stranger wouldn't be so bad, at least for a few months. He rewrote his filters, taking a chance on a few roommate-wanted posts that seemed less sketchy than the others. Most of the interviews were disasters. A weed-fogged artist's loft with a no-talking before noon rule, a tiny walk-up with a couple who openly argued about money during the tour, and one guy who demanded a criminal background check for the vibes. Just when he was about to throw in the towel and brave his mom's guest room in New Jersey, Ethan came across a listing that stopped him cold. Looking for a roommate to share spacious 2-bedroom loft in Bushwick. Night worker apartment is all yours most evenings. Daytime silence required. The attached photos showed exposed brick sunlight streaming across a sparkling kitchen and just enough lived-in charm to look inviting. But it was the promise of daytime quiet that hooked Ethan. He'd just switched to remote work, and the thought of uninterrupted hours to code or nap was almost too good to be true. He reached out half expecting a scam or some Craigslist weirdo. Instead, the reply was short, polite, and professional. Victor Saarinen. Let's set up a time to chat. By the next day, Ethan was standing outside a converted warehouse on Hudson Street, clutching a fresh coffee and trying to talk himself into optimism. After everything he'd been through, all he really wanted was somewhere safe, a place to regroup, to lick his wounds, and maybe to start believing again in the possibility of something normal. He had no idea what was waiting for him behind that steel door, but New York was a city of second chances, and Ethan wasn't ready to quit just yet. The autumn air still clung to Ethan's jacket as he buzzed the door to 144 Hudson Street, an unassuming brick building wedged between a coffee roaster and an aging discount furniture store. He'd expected the place to be cramped, creaky, or just plain weird, a relic of 1,000 Craigslist letdowns. But when Victor Saarinen opened the door, everything Ethan thought he knew about New York apartments got upended in an instant. The entryway alone seemed bigger than his old living room. The ceiling stretched upward in graceful arcs. Sunlight spilled through industrial windows and painted the hardwood floors in golden streaks. Exposed brick walls were softened by the occasional splash of modern art, something abstract in muted colors, probably expensive but hung without any sign of ego. Victor himself was nearly as much of a surprise as the space he occupied. He was tall, sharply built, maybe mid-30s, with pale blonde hair, combed back in a way that suggested either effortless style or strict self-discipline. His voice was low and reserved, carrying the faintest accent that Ethan guessed was Scandinavian, though Victor simply introduced himself as Finnish. He wore dark jeans and a crisp black turtleneck, unapologetically minimalist, but without looking forced. The handshake was brief, professional, but there was a kind of old-school courtesy in it that Ethan found oddly reassuring. Victor wasted no time with small talk. He gave Ethan a brisk tour, pointing out the features of the loft with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before newly remodeled kitchen with gleaming stainless steel appliances. No microwave, but I keep a French press if you like coffee. 2 spacious bedrooms with private bathrooms. A living area that doubled as a film editing nook. There were shelves filled with film scripts, vintage cameras, and neatly labeled boxes, but almost no sign of clutter or chaos. Victor's own room was closed. Just my workspace. I keep it locked, but the room available to Ethan was pristine, flooded with afternoon light, and had a walk-in closet bigger than most Manhattan studios. It all seemed almost too good to be true. When Ethan asked about the rent, Victor simply nodded. My work pays well enough. I need help with the mortgage, not profit. I'm gone most nights for shoots, so the apartment is yours after 7 p.m. Most important, I require total silence during the day. No music, no TV, no loud phone calls. The walls are thin, and I sleep from sunrise to sunset. Victor explained he worked as an independent filmmaker, mostly at night, and preferred a home free of distractions when he returned in the morning. There were no rules about food or visitors, no drama about cleaning schedules, just the simple request for peace during the daylight hours. Ethan, desperate for a refuge, and not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, agreed to everything on the spot. Something about Victor's manner, the economy of words, the gentle but firm expectations felt oddly comforting. Maybe it was the fact that Victor didn't seem to care about the usual roommate drama. Or maybe it was just relief that someone finally seemed to value quiet as much as Ethan did. As he signed the lease and handed over the first month's rent, Ethan felt a cautious hope flicker inside. After all the chaos, maybe this strange new living arrangement was exactly what he needed. Little did he know, the true strangeness was only just beginning. Ethan's first week in the new loft passed in a blur of cautious optimism. The transition from motel purgatory to the airy heights of 144 Hudson Street was like stepping from a windowless basement into a sunlit atrium. For a while he reveled in the apartment's sanctuary-like calm, working his remote job from the cozy kitchen table, making espresso in the French press Victor had so graciously left out, and listening to the low hum of the city outside the thick glass. Victor's rules were strict, but easy enough to live with. If anything, the insistence on silence was a blessing. Most mornings, Victor's bedroom door remained firmly closed, and there was never so much as a sound from the other side. Sometimes Ethan wondered if Victor was even home at all, or if the man truly was a ghost, who merely rented out space in the mortal world for show. It wasn't long, though, before Ethan began to notice small oddities that nagged at him in the quieter moments. It started with the kitchen. Victor kept everything in almost surgical order, the knives in their block aligned perfectly, stacked alphabetically, the fridge arranged like a magazine spread. But what really caught Ethan's eye was how quickly things changed. One night, the refrigerator would be nearly empty, maybe a carton of oat milk, a block of tofu, and a few sad-looking carrots. By the next afternoon, it would be fully stocked with neatly labeled meal prep containers, each dated in Victor's precise handwriting. Ethan never once heard the sound of cooking. No sizzle, no microwave beeps, not even the clatter of pots and pans. It was as if the food materialized out of thin air while he worked in the next room. Victor's presence, or rather his eerie lack of it, grew increasingly unsettling. Some nights, Ethan would return from a quick run to the bodega and catch a glimpse of Victor in the dim light, slipping silently out the door, dressed all in black film equipment slung over his shoulder. They rarely crossed paths, but when they did, Victor was always polite, but distant eyes, hidden behind thin, wire-framed glasses, voice never rising above a whisper. There were no late-night TV sessions, no sounds of footsteps or phone calls. If Ethan didn't know better, he'd have thought he was living alone. The apartment itself seemed to respond to Victor's moods. On nights when Victor was gone, the space felt open, almost welcoming. But when Victor was home, even locked away in his room, there was a tension in the air, a subtle shift in atmosphere that made Ethan tread more lightly. Once, when Ethan's phone rang a little too loudly in the afternoon, he heard Victor's voice from behind his closed door. "Please, Ethan, keep it down." There was no anger, only a cold edge of finality that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Ethan tried to brush it off. After all, he had what he wanted: a beautiful apartment, peace and quiet, and a roommate who respected his boundaries. But the sense of being watched, of sharing space with someone who existed just on the edge of normal, began to burrow into his daily life. He chalked it up to stress, to city living, to the remnants of heartbreak that still clung to his bones. Yet late at night, as the building settled and the city's noises faded away, Ethan sometimes wondered if he was sharing the apartment with something much stranger than just another New Yorker. The strangeness in the apartment had been subtle, a shadow at the edge of comfort, a low hum behind the ordinary. But that subtlety shattered one gray Thursday when Victor, in his usual clipped tone, texted Ethan mid-afternoon. "May I use the loft for a shoot tonight? My studio fell through. Would need quiet from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. There will be guests. Polite, direct, no apology. Just another rule as cold and sharp as the others." Ethan hesitated. But what choice did he have? Victor always kept his word, always cleaned up after himself, and besides, wasn't this what living in New York was about? You rolled with the oddness, found your own space in the city's churning tide of artists and eccentrics. Ethan agreed, texting back a thumbs up, and made plans to keep to his room that night. But curiosity nipped at him as the sun set, and the apartment took on an uncanny quiet. Around 6:45, there was a brisk knock at the door. Victor ushered in two guests. A petite, serious-looking woman in a faded denim jacket, Lena Koskinen. Victor introduced in passing, and a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a battered camera bag slung over one shoulder, Mike Russo, an American, whose handshake was damp but friendly. Both had the same air of quiet focus, the same understated weirdness that seemed to cling to Victor. Victor gave Ethan a curt nod. "We'll be working in the living room. Please don't leave your room until we finish. It's important for the process." Something about his tone made it less a request and more an order. And Ethan, some of the sounds you may hear tonight could be disturbing. Please remember, it's just a performance. No one is being hurt. That last line, delivered in Victor's near whisper, trailed a cold finger down Ethan's back. He retreated upstairs with his laptop, settling in for what he figured would be a long night of movies and games. From his window, he could see the flickering glow of Bushwick nightlife, the M train rattling over Broadway, a city alive with noise. Downstairs, the apartment was cloaked in an unnatural hush. No laughter, no equipment clatter, just the faint shuffle of feet on hardwood. For a while, Ethan almost convinced himself nothing unusual would happen. He put on his noise-canceling headphones, queued up a playlist, and tried to lose himself in a new documentary. It started quietly at first. Soft murmurs, the click of a camera. A woman's voice reciting lines. He caught snippets. "Don't, please, I can't," in Lena's clear, trembling tone. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was just method acting, but the sounds grew sharper, stranger. Suddenly, a piercing scream ripped through the silence, so raw, so animal, that Ethan jerked upright, heart pounding. It went on, cresting into ragged sobs and desperate gasping pleas for mercy. "No, please, please don't." Lena's voice, thick with terror, echoed through the floorboards. Ethan knew intellectually that it had to be fake. Victor had warned him. Yet something primal inside him recoiled at those sounds. Every instinct screamed at him to go downstairs, to help, to intervene. But his body felt anchored by dread. Instead, he turned up his music, pressing his headphones tighter against his ears. Still, the shrieks found their way in, like cold water seeping through cracks. He told himself to think rationally. This was New York. People made art out of chaos here. But there was a quality to the cries that didn't feel like art at all. They felt ancient, the voice of prey pleading with a predator. Ethan tried to focus on his laptop, but his hands shook as another wail cut through, then abruptly silence. He took off his headphones, listening. Muffled voices floated up a low rhythmic chant, almost musical. At first, he couldn't make out the words, but as the tempo increased, he caught the phrase repeated in feverish unison. "Hail Lucifer, hail Lucifer." The words twisted through the quiet, blending with the ambient buzz of the city, and leaving Ethan frozen, sweat prickling along his arms. The chanting grew louder, building to a climax, then cut off as suddenly as it began. After that, only silence. Ethan sat on his bed, adrenaline spiking, unable to move or think. He checked the time, nearly midnight. He debated texting a friend, calling the cops, or even just pounding on the wall to make it stop. But Victor's warning echoed in his mind. It's just performance. He reasoned that if Lena was in real trouble, she would scream for help in a different way. He lay down, heart racing, and finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When he awoke, dawn was just beginning to gray the sky over Brooklyn. Downstairs, the apartment was silent. Ethan showered his thoughts, churning. He couldn't shake the memory of those screams, the way they had clawed at something deep and ancient inside him. As he made coffee, Victor emerged, looking uncharacteristically tired, but composed. "Thank you for your patience last night," Victor said quietly, his face unreadable. "It went well? There will be no repeats." He handed Ethan a fresh croissant from the corner bakery, a peace offering that felt both thoughtful and chillingly routine. Ethan accepted it, unsure what to say. Part of him wanted to demand answers, to know what exactly had happened beneath his feet the night before. But as he looked at Victor's placid expression, the calm mask that gave away nothing, he realized he wasn't sure he wanted to know. In New York, sometimes, the strangest thing you could do was to mind your own business, and sometimes it was the only way to stay safe. That morning, as the city's din returned and the sun spilled over the rooftops, Ethan found himself thinking less about rent and heartbreak, and more about the question that lingered unanswered in the quiet spaces of his new home. What had he really agreed to? Living here with Victor Saarinen? The memory of those cries and that feverish chant haunted him, threading through his day like a shadow. It was the moment he understood, truly understood, that some secrets in New York were best left untouched. The next afternoon, as the October sun slanted through the warehouse windows and Brooklyn's weekday noise returned to its usual background hum, Ethan lingered in the kitchen, torn between curiosity and apprehension. The previous night's cries and chants still echoed uncomfortably in his memory, too real, too visceral to simply file away as performance art. When Victor finally emerged, showered and dressed in his usual monochrome, he moved with his characteristic composure, but Ethan thought he detected a faint weariness around the eyes, a subtle edge missing from his usual careful energy. Ethan hesitated, not wanting to seem paranoid, but couldn't help blurting, "Everything okay with the shoot last night, I hope?" Nothing got out of hand. Victor paused, then offered a small, almost reassuring smile. "All as expected. Lena is a very talented actress. The project required some intense ADR automated dialogue replacement. Sometimes it's easier for actors to get the right emotion in a private setting." He explained that the screaming, the begging, even the chanting were all scripted elements of a highly experimental film. No one was ever at risk. In fact, Lena has played even more demanding roles, Victor added with a confidence that was meant to comfort but left Ethan strangely unsettled. "I understand the noise was unpleasant. I appreciate your patience and your discretion. It won't happen again without advance notice." Ethan nodded, trying to convince himself that Victor's explanation was perfectly reasonable. Maybe he was overreacting, letting imagination get the best of him. In a city of millions, who was he to question the boundaries of art? Still, Victor's calm assurance that clinical detachment made it all feel just a bit too controlled, too rehearsed, like the mask of a man who always knew a little more than he let on. For the rest of the week, Ethan caught himself flinching at the smallest noises, a door creaking, the rattle of pipes, the clang of a distant train. He told himself to relax, to be grateful for the peace and the promise of normalcy, but the seed of unease had already taken root. He realized for the first time that true quiet isn't always comforting, and that in certain places it can even feel like a warning. 2 weeks slipped by with only the faintest echoes of that strange, harrowing night. The apartment had reverted to its usual rhythm of deep daytime silence and quiet, solitary evenings. Victor kept his promise, never mentioning another project, never bringing guests, and always greeting Ethan with the same polite reserve. For a while, the uneasy knot in Ethan's chest began to loosen, at least enough for him to start sleeping through the night again. Maybe, he reasoned, Victor really was just an eccentric, and Brooklyn was crawling with stories far weirder than his own. Still, the memory of Lena's guttural pleas and the fevered chanting haunted Ethan at odd moments, a ghost behind the clatter of keys or the low moan of autumn wind against the windows. It was on a Friday that Victor almost apologetically texted studio cancellation. Need to use the loft for filming again this evening. Will compensate for any inconvenience. No noise upstairs after 8 p.m. Please let me know if this is a problem. Ethan read the message with a flutter of unease, but he'd just started seeing someone, a graphic designer named Hannah, and the timing worked in his favor. No worries, I'll be out late anyway, he replied. He planned a dinner date, and if things went well, a movie back at Hannah's place. There was no need to come home before midnight, maybe even later. With that settled, Ethan tried to put Victor's world out of his mind. The evening played out like a scene from someone else's life, cozy bar in Williamsburg. Laughter, whiskey sours, and the warmth of easy company. By 11 p.m., Ethan was relaxed and a little tipsy, already imagining a weekend spent far from Victor's odd rituals. But as he and Hannah queued up an old movie, Ethan's phone buzzed a reminder from his calendar about a work call the next morning. He reached for his laptop charger only to find the plug was missing. Annoyed, he realized he'd left it plugged in at the apartment. I'll be right back, he told Hannah, already regretting it. It'll take 20 minutes tops. He texted Victor as a courtesy. Hey, just grabbing my charger, I'll be quick, but got no reply. Figuring Victor was busy filming, Ethan hopped on the L train, the night air nipping at his collar, as he hurried down the dark block toward Hudson Street. The building was quiet, lobby empty, the elevator humming alone as it carried him up. At the apartment door, Ethan paused, knocking lightly out of habit. No answer. He listened, muffled voices shuffling, the faint metallic ring of something heavy being moved. It could have been anything. Steeling himself, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. He was not prepared for what he saw. The once inviting loft was transformed, almost unrecognizable. Heavy plastic sheets hung from the ceiling, and walls catching and scattering the light from standing lamps. Every surface, floors, countertops, even the backs of chairs, was swathed in clear sheeting, slick and clinical, as if the apartment had been prepped for a messy crime scene or an industrial cleaning. A sharp tang hung in the air, bleach maybe, or some harsh chemical. Ethan's shoes squeaked on the plastic as he stepped inside, calling softly Victor. His voice was swallowed by the room, falling flat and inconsequential. That's when he heard it, heavy footsteps in the hall, purposeful and fast. 2 men appeared around the corner, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in identical black suits, faces concealed behind matte black plastic masks with only pinholes for eyes. They moved in silent coordination like nightclub bouncers or private security, but there was nothing reassuring about them. Ethan barely had time to register the threat before they were on him, one grabbing his arms, the other pinning his shoulders, slamming him down on the plastic-wrapped floor with force that left him gasping for breath. Hey, wait! I live here, he shouted, trying to twist free. The only response was a quick clinical jab of something sharp against his thigh. A sudden electric jolt that shot up his leg, leaving him paralyzed and shuddering. His mind spun panic, clawing at the edges of reason. Who were these people? Where was Victor? He heard voices, one deeper and unfamiliar, barked from the next room. "What's going on, intruder?" the masked men replied in unison. Ethan tried to protest, but his mouth was numb and uncooperative. "Get him out," came the order. The two men dragged Ethan into the corridor, dumping him unceremoniously in front of his own door. Then just as quickly they retreated inside, slamming the door behind them and leaving him sprawled in the hall, heart hammering, skin tingling with aftershocks from the stun gun. For a moment, Ethan lay there stunned, not just physically, but with the realization that whatever had been going on in that apartment was far beyond the realm of filmmaking. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking, and dialed 911. "There are people in my apartment. They attacked me. Something's wrong," he told the dispatcher, trying to keep his voice steady. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. Ethan forced himself upright, nerves jangling, staring at the door as if it might come alive. When the police finally arrived, Ethan led them upstairs, mind racing with all the possible horrors waiting behind that door. But when they opened it, the apartment was immaculate. No plastic sheeting, no men in black, no sign of anything amiss. Victor greeted them calmly, apologizing for the confusion and insisting that Ethan must have interrupted a private gathering for which security had been arranged. The officers, finding no evidence, took down Ethan's report with a note of skepticism, then left with little fanfare. As Victor closed the door behind them, Ethan caught his roommate's eyes, cold, unreadable, and for the first time quietly threatening. That night, back in the hall with his charger clutched in trembling hands, Ethan understood something essential about his own instincts. He'd ignored them in the name of reason, politeness, and city logic. Now the last shred of comfort had been torn away, replaced by a hollow certainty. Whatever Victor was involved in, Ethan needed to get out, and quickly. The rest of that night unfolded with a surreal slow-motion quality that left Ethan questioning his own sanity. After the police officers left the apartment, having found nothing out of place, Ethan lingered just outside his own door, his mind racing through a looping montage of what he'd witnessed: the plastic sheeting, the masked men, the clinical efficiency with which he'd been tossed into the hallway. But inside, everything was pristine ordinary. Even the faint chemical tang he'd noticed earlier seemed to have dissipated. Victor had handled the officers with chilling composure, his story airtight. "We were hosting a small private event," he explained, the same calm voice Ethan had come to know. "Those men were security, perhaps a little overzealous in protecting our privacy. I assure you there's been a terrible misunderstanding." To the untrained eye, Victor was the model of urban sophistication. An independent filmmaker, always reserved, now expressing earnest regret that his friend and roommate had been caught in the crossfire of professional boundaries. The police, perhaps weary from real emergencies, seemed to buy it. Their questions grew more perfunctory with every round. Ethan tried to insist he described the masks, the plastic, the way he'd been tased and dragged out, but without any physical evidence or witnesses, the officer's skepticism only deepened. One even suggested that Ethan might be overworked or had gotten spooked by the city's nightlife. Eventually, they left with little more than a stern warning about calling 911 for personal disputes. Inside the apartment, Victor closed the door, and his polite mask slipped just for a second. Next time, he said quietly, "Respect my privacy, as agreed. I can't guarantee your safety if you don't." The words were delivered in the same gentle tone Victor used for everything, but the threat beneath them was clear as a razor's edge. Ethan felt a chill burrow into his bones. The man standing before him was not simply eccentric. He was dangerous in a way that Ethan couldn't fully name. That night, sleep was impossible. Ethan scrolled through message threads with friends, considered packing a bag and leaving right then, but fear and shock rooted him in place. He called the police precinct twice for updates, only to be told that no further action is pending unless something concrete turned up. It was as if the whole incident had been wiped away his terror, his assault erased by Victor's smooth explanations and the city's indifference. In the pale hours before dawn, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, eyes darting to every shadow. The realization hit him with cold finality. New York could swallow up even the strangest stories, letting the dangerous and the odd slip quietly between the cracks. In that silence, Ethan's resolve hardened he would find a way out, and this time, he would trust the voice inside him that said, "Get out while you still can." In the days that followed, Ethan lived with a heightened, almost animal awareness. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of light under Victor's bedroom door set his nerves jangling. The apartment, that once felt like a rare Brooklyn sanctuary, now seemed to close in on him, the silence growing heavier with every hour. He went about his work as usual, kept to himself, but the easy peace between roommates had vanished. Victor, for his part, made no effort to explain or apologize further. He moved through the loft with the same deliberate quiet, but Ethan noticed that his glances lingered longer. His presence carried a different kind of weight, a silent warning, or maybe just the awareness that the unspoken contract between them had been shattered. On the third morning after the incident, Ethan found Victor in the kitchen, methodically preparing coffee in the French press. The aroma should have felt comforting, but instead, it filled Ethan with a sharp sense of displacement, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. He steeled himself, determined to force a conversation that would break the oppressive silence. "I'm moving out," he said, the words sounding braver than he felt. "This isn't working anymore. I'll be gone by the end of the week." Victor's hands didn't even tremble as he poured hot water over the grounds. He looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes with that same unreadable expression he'd worn the night the police left. "That's probably best," Victor replied softly, his voice even and strangely devoid of any emotion. "Some people are not meant for certain kinds of quiet." For a moment, Ethan wanted to ask, wanted to demand answers about the masked men, the plastic, the chanting, and the fear that now colored every corner of the apartment. But there was a finality in Victor's gaze, a calm that made Ethan realize nothing he said would ever change the truth, whatever it was. Instead, he nodded, retreating to his room to pack the few belongings he had brought into the loft. Each item, a book, a sweater. The chipped mug he'd taken from his last apartment felt like a small victory, a reclaimed piece of himself from the shadows that had begun to gather in Victor's presence. By the end of the week, Ethan was gone, the keys to 144 Hudson Street left on the pristine marble countertop. As he rolled his suitcase through the lobby and out into the crisp Brooklyn air, the city seemed to breathe with him again, no longer stifling, but alive with promise and the faint hope of new beginnings. Yet, even as the noise of the city swallowed him up, a part of Ethan remained haunted. He replayed the sounds and silences of that apartment in his mind, the fevered cries, the cold plastic hush, Victor's careful voice, and chilling threats. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, Ethan wondered what he'd really survived. Other times, he was just grateful to have left before learning the full answer. Some secrets, he realized, are best left undisturbed. In New York, there are shadows even sunlight can't reach, and he, for one, was finally wise enough to walk away. Years later, when Ethan passed by the old building on Hudson Street, he never looked up. The memories of that strange, silent loft stayed with him, not as nightmares, but as a lesson whispered from the shadows. In a city overflowing with stories, some doors are better left closed, and some mysteries better left unsolved. Ethan had learned to trust his instincts, to recognize when a quiet place held something far darker than loneliness. Brooklyn, in all its noise and chaos, suddenly felt safer. He walked on, blending into the crowds, quietly grateful for the life and the secrets he'd left behind. Jack Turner had never imagined he would leave the familiar gray streets of Newcastle for the sun-washed coast of Bournemouth. But life sometimes turns in the most unexpected ways. At 22, Jack was still finding his place in the world, fresh out of university, uncertain about his career, but certain about Bethany Price, the girl who had captured his attention through a string of late-night Facebook chats. Bethany lived with her mother and younger brother in Bournemouth, and while their relationship was still new, the distance was starting to wear thin on both of them. Jack's closest friends, Charlie Woods and Ryan Blake, had known him since childhood, the kind of friends who could read each other's minds with a glance. Charlie practical and protective, and Ryan easygoing with a mischievous streak, both watched Jack's decision to move south with a mix of excitement and concern. They understood his longing for a fresh start, but they also knew the risks that came with leaving everything familiar behind, especially for a place as unknown as Bournemouth. The city itself held a strange allure, a mix of retirees, university students, and tourists. Its beaches and bustling nightlife, a far cry from Newcastle's steady drizzle. As Jack packed his belongings and browsed listings for a room to rent, he could feel both the thrill of new beginnings and a whisper of apprehension in his chest. Little did he know this next chapter would lead him down a path more dangerous and bizarre than anything he could have imagined. The move itself was a whirlwind. Jack crammed his life into the back of his old hatchback, said hasty goodbyes to his parents and friends, and pointed his car south, chasing a future he could only half picture. When he first arrived in Bournemouth, everything felt new and slightly unreal. The air smelled of salt and fresh-cut grass. The streets bustled with students and retirees alike, and the unfamiliar southern accents of his new neighbors were a constant reminder that he wasn't in Newcastle anymore. Bethany met him at the station, her laughter contagious, her optimism rubbing off on Jack, even as he tried to hide his nerves. For the first few nights, he slept on an air mattress in her family's garage, spending the days searching for apartments and applying to every job listing. He could find dishwashing waiting tables, even a few odd construction gigs. The room for rent ads were a mixed bag. Some places were shockingly expensive. Others looked like they hadn't seen a mop in years. After 2 weeks of failed viewings and tense budgeting, he finally landed a promising lead, a 2-bedroom flat just outside the city center, offered at a reasonable rate by a guy named Darren Murphy. The first meeting was oddly reassuring. Darren, with his easy banter and taste in horror movies, seemed genuinely friendly. The flat wasn't spotless, but Jack figured he could handle a little clutter if it meant independence. By the end of their conversation, Jack was almost relieved to have met someone who on the surface seemed normal enough to share a roof with. He called Charlie and Ryan that night, his voice buzzing with relief, describing the flat and his new roommate in glowing terms. At last, it felt like the pieces of Jack's new life were finally falling into place. Settling into the new apartment, Jack at first felt a sense of accomplishment, but as the days ticked by, subtle cracks began to show in the easy camaraderie he'd shared with Darren. It started small dirty dishes multiplying in the sink, takeout boxes piling up on the counter, and a faint but persistent smell of cigarettes that no amount of open windows could clear. Jack found himself picking up after Darren, more and more chalking it up to differences in upbringing, or maybe just the stress of moving. But soon, the clutter became something darker: beer cans in every corner, sticky rings on the coffee table, and strange stains appearing on the carpet. Darren, who'd been so friendly and talkative, at first began to retreat into himself. He slept through the mornings and was up all night, sometimes blasting heavy metal so loud it rattled the kitchenware. When Jack tried to talk to him, Darren either laughed things off or grew defensive, muttering about how he liked to live free and couldn't stand neat freaks. Still, Jack tried to make it work. He figured everyone had quirks, and maybe things would settle down once Darren adjusted to having a roommate. But then, Darren's friends started showing up at odd hours, rough-looking guys with quick eyes and stained hands. They stayed late, smoking in the living room and exchanging stories that made Jack's skin crawl. On one occasion, Jack overheard a heated argument about boosting and moving product phrases that sent his imagination racing. He realized with a jolt that he didn't really know anything about Darren's life outside the apartment. One night, Jack returned from a shift at the local pub to find Darren passed out on the couch, an empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand, and the front door left wide open to the street. Anxiety crept in, then took root. Jack stopped inviting Bethany over, worried about what she might witness, and even his calls to Charlie and Ryan took on a more guarded tone. He downplayed his discomfort, but could hear the edge in his own voice. The apartment, once a symbol of independence, now felt claustrophobic and unsafe. Each new day brought another oddity, another sign that Jack's leap of faith had landed him somewhere far stranger and far riskier than he'd ever bargained for. The oddities soon gave way to outright tension, and Jack found himself walking on eggshells in his own home. Darren's moods became unpredictable one evening. He'd be boisterous and chatty, regaling Jack with wild stories of his teenage escapades, and the next he'd be irritable and withdrawn, his eyes bloodshot and his words slurred by drink. The late-night music grew into a cacophony, shaking the apartment's thin walls, making sleep a luxury Jack could rarely afford. Darren's friends came and went at all hours, and their presence unsettled Jack even more. Sometimes they brought drugs, filling the living room with a chemical haze that stuck to the curtains for days. Jack tried to avoid confrontation, often locking himself in his room with headphones just to drown out the chaos. One night, as Jack returned home after a long shift, he found the apartment eerily silent until he saw Darren in the hallway practicing what looked like slow-motion swordplay with a replica samurai sword. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent light. As Darren spun it, his focus intense and slightly manic. Jack froze in the doorway, feeling an instinctive urge to back away. Darren grinned and said it was just for fun, but the message was clear. He was not a man to be challenged lightly. From that point on, the apartment felt less like a shared space and more like a minefield. Things grew even more alarming when Darren's girlfriend, Sophie Allen, began spending nights at the flat. Jack witnessed several uncomfortable scenes. Sophie flinching at Darren's temper, her voice shrinking to a whisper during his rages. The walls did little to muffle the arguments, and once Jack woke to the sound of glass shattering in the living room. As the violence escalated, so did Jack's fear. He began locking his door at night, stacking a chair under the handle for good measure. Darren's unpredictable outbursts, the constant mess, and the underlying threat of real violence left Jack exhausted and on edge. He lost weight, struggled to focus at work, and stopped answering calls from friends, too ashamed to admit how dire his living situation had become. The independence he'd worked so hard for now felt like a cage. In that suffocating environment, Jack realized he couldn't endure much more, but every day the risk of trying to escape seemed just as dangerous as staying put. By early autumn, Jack reached his breaking point. The lines between discomfort and danger had blurred to nothing. He was tiptoeing around his own apartment, rationing his time outside his room and barely sleeping at night. Every interaction with Darren left Jack's nerves frayed. But what truly pushed him over the edge was witnessing Darren lash out at Sophie in a fit of rage, leaving her sobbing and cowering in the corner. That night, Jack stared at the ceiling, feeling powerless and trapped. He couldn't ignore the risk any longer. He had to get out, but the prospect of confronting Darren or leaving while he was home filled him with dread. That's when Jack decided to reach out to the people he trusted most. In the dim glow of his phone, he typed a message to Charlie and Ryan, his words stumbling over one another as he explained just how bad things had gotten. Within minutes, both friends responded with unwavering support. They insisted he wasn't alone and promised they'd be down to Bournemouth by the weekend. Jack felt the first spark of hope he'd had in weeks. The plan wasn't fully formed, but knowing his friends would be at his side made escape feel possible for the first time. It was the beginning of a risky, desperate bid for freedom. A bid that would require courage, careful planning, and more than a little luck to pull off safely. Charlie and Ryan wasted no time. That Friday, they packed Charlie's old sedan with sandwiches, bottled water, and a couple of overnight bags, then made the long, winding drive from Newcastle to Bournemouth. The journey was a blur of anxious conversation and nervous laughter, both of them speculating about the true extent of Jack's predicament. When they arrived, Jack met them outside his apartment complex, looking gaunter and more frazzled than either of them had ever seen. After a brief but heartfelt reunion, the three friends slipped into the cluttered flat, careful to keep their voices low and movements quiet. Darren was out something Jack had carefully tracked all week, giving them just enough time to assess the situation and start forming a plan. The mood inside the apartment was tense. The mess and lingering smell of stale smoke made it clear how hard life had become for Jack. That evening, over takeout pizza and whispered strategy sessions in Jack's cramped bedroom, they mapped out every detail of the escape. Their plan relied on speed and stealth. They would wait for Sunday afternoon, when Darren was usually out for hours on his errands, to quickly move Jack's belongings to Bethany's mother's garage across town. They rehearsed the route-listed priorities, passport phone essentials first, and made sure Jack kept his phone charged at all times. Each friend took on a role: Charlie as lookout, Ryan as driver, Jack as point man for packing. It all felt a little like plotting a heist, but the stakes were as real as they came. For Jack, every hour brought both fear and a growing sense of relief. For Charlie and Ryan, it was a mission to save a friend from a situation none of them could have predicted, but all were determined to see through. But just as their plan seemed airtight, the first sign of trouble arrived sooner than expected. Late Friday night, while the trio quietly finalized their checklist, the jangling sound of keys at the door sent a shockwave through the apartment. Darren had returned early, swaggering into the living room with a six-pack in one hand and his girlfriend Sophie trailing behind him. For a moment, the air was thick with unease. Darren hadn't been told about the visitors, but he barely blinked, simply flashing a crooked grin and welcoming Charlie and Ryan as if they were old friends. Perfect timing. He slurred, cracking open a beer and dropping onto the worn sofa. We're having a party tonight. What followed was a surreal, nerve-wracking few hours as Darren turned up the music, poured drinks, and loudly invited a couple of his friends over to join the impromptu gathering. The apartment filled with strangers, the smell of cheap beer, and the electric tension that comes from knowing things could spiral out of control at any moment. Charlie and Ryan kept close to Jack, exchanging anxious glances, as Darren, emboldened by alcohol and whatever drugs he was consuming, became louder and less predictable. Sophie, pale and withdrawn, hovered near the kitchen, flinching whenever Darren raised his voice. Eventually, Darren insisted that everyone join in the drinking games, mocking those who declined and pressuring Jack to be a good sport. Jack, caught between fear and the need to keep the peace, reluctantly played along. As the night wore on, Darren's mood swung between manic excitement and simmering aggression. When the music peaked and the party guests were all crammed into the cramped living room, Darren grabbed Sophie for a dance that quickly turned rough. He twisted her arm, then wrapped his hands around her neck in a mock chokehold that went on far too long. The moment Sophie struggled, the room fell silent. Jack's pulse raced as he and Charlie exchanged a look. This was the danger they'd feared. In that instant, Ryan intervened, pulling Darren away, just as Sophie gasped for air and retreated to Darren's bedroom, slamming the door behind her. The party unraveled quickly after that. Darren, furious and unpredictable, started yelling at everyone to leave. Charlie and Ryan helped Jack retreat to his room, locking the door as they heard Darren's rage echoing down the hall. Their carefully laid plans now felt as fragile as glass, with the threat of real violence hanging heavy in the air. The next morning, the apartment was thick with a tension that made even breathing feel risky. Darren's explosive mood swings the night before had shaken everyone. While most of his friends had slunk off during the chaos, the core group, Jack, Charlie, and Ryan, huddled quietly in Jack's room, reviewing their plan and nervously glancing at the clock. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the window, a steady soundtrack to their anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards or muffled voice from the hallway sent a jolt through the trio. Darren, hungover and sullen, barely spoke, but his unpredictability lingered in every shadow. When he finally left in the early afternoon for his usual errands, the apartment seemed to exhale in relief. Moving quickly but silently, Jack and his friends sprang into action. With bags already packed and essentials set aside, they began ferrying Jack's belongings down the back stairs, working with a precision that would have impressed any special ops team. Charlie kept watch from the window, alert for any sign of Darren's return, while Ryan idled the car just out of sight, ready to speed away if necessary. They worked methodically, the adrenaline of fear pushing them to move faster than they thought possible. The process felt surreal here. They were three ordinary guys carrying boxes and backpacks, like thieves in the daylight hearts, pounding at every unexpected noise. As they made their final trip down the steps, Jack couldn't help but look over his shoulder, half expecting Darren to come barreling around the corner. But the universe for once seemed to be on their side. By mid-afternoon, nearly all of Jack's possessions were stashed in Bethany's mother's garage. Exhausted but triumphant, the trio stood outside in the drizzle, sharing a shaky laugh as the weight of weeks of anxiety began to lift. But just as they were about to head back for a last sweep, Jack's phone buzzed with an unknown number, Darren's name flashing across the screen. The moment froze. Darren somehow had figured out that something was up and was heading back. The boys rushed inside, intending to grab the last bag and be gone before he returned. But their luck finally ran out. As they ducked into the hallway, Darren burst through the door, eyes wild, demanding to know what was going on. The confrontation escalated quickly. Darren's anger erupted, shouting threats, and in his rage, the brandishing of the replica sword. Charlie dialed 911, voice shaking, as he reported an armed and violent roommate. Within minutes, sirens wailed outside. The police arrived, diffusing the standoff and taking Darren into custody after a brief, tense struggle. Finally, battered by nerves but safe. Jack and his friends watched as the police led Darren away. They knew their escape had come just in time and by the skin of their teeth. After the chaos had finally subsided, Jack moved into Bethany's mother's garage, a far cry from a dream apartment, but it was clean, safe, and most importantly, free from Darren's volatility. Surrounded by stacks of storage bins and old bicycles, Jack slept better than he had in weeks, the simple silence of the space offering a comfort he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Charlie and Ryan stayed for another day to help him get settled. Then the trio marked their survival with burgers and milkshakes at a roadside diner, a quiet, bittersweet celebration. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a deep exhaustion and an undercurrent of disbelief at how quickly things had escalated. Jack was grateful to be free, yet the experience left marks he couldn't shake so easily. Loud noises made him tense up, and he found himself checking locks twice before bed. Through it all, Bethany remained steadfastly by his side, and the friendship with Charlie and Ryan grew even stronger, bonded by the ordeal. But the memory of Sophie, still trapped in her toxic relationship with Darren, lingered like a shadow. Jack's rescue was complete, but not everyone had escaped. The story haunted him not just as a tale of escape, but as a reminder of the people who couldn't so easily walk away. In the weeks that followed, Jack slowly pieced his life back together, carrying both scars and hard-won wisdom from his brush with danger and the unexpected kindness of true friends. Jack's ordeal was more than just a wild chapter in his young life. It was a hard lesson in caution, courage, and the power of friendship. Looking back, he realized how easily anyone could slip into a dangerous situation, mistaking surface-level normalcy for true safety. The experience taught him that speaking up and seeking help is never a weakness, but often the bravest thing a person can do. Most of all, it reaffirmed the strength found in loyal friends, the kind who show up face down threats and stick around for the hard parts. Jack carried those lessons with him, more watchful now when trusting strangers, but also more willing to reach out and help others in need. His story became a quiet warning that beneath the ordinary can lurk the truly unexpected, and that nobody should face those shadows alone. For Jack, and for anyone listening, it was a call to look out for one another, no matter how strange things get. In the end, Jack's story wasn't just about escaping a nightmare roommate. It was about rediscovering trust. learning the true meaning of friendship and finding strength even in the darkest moments. Life eventually returned to a quieter rhythm. But Jack never forgot how quickly things could spiral and how much it mattered to have people by his side. As he settled into his new life, he carried forward a simple but powerful truth. Sometimes the scariest experiences lead us to the best parts of ourselves and remind us that no one. Growing up in a rough part of Billings, Montana, Ethan Morgan was no stranger to trouble. By his early 20s, Ethan had already fallen deep into the grip of oxycodone addiction, a path that led to petty theft and run-ins with the local police. He'd heard the warnings on TV from teachers and even from his own weary mother, but none of it mattered when the craving hit. The final straw came late one night, after a break-in gone wrong landing Ethan in handcuffs and standing before a stern-faced judge. This time, though, there was a fork in the road: serve a hard sentence behind bars or enroll in a mandatory rehabilitation program called the Farmstead. The Farmstead, a sprawling rehab farm out on the edge of the plains, promised tough love and even tougher labor. It sounded like a last resort, the kind of place you'd hear about in stories, not somewhere you'd ever expect to land yourself. Yet for Ethan, this unlikely place would mark the start of something stranger and more life-changing than he could ever have imagined. Ethan didn't have high hopes, as the county sheriff dropped him off at the farmstead, a 100-acre stretch of windswept fields and aging barns set far from the main roads. There was a chill in the air, maybe from the weather, maybe from the way everyone eyed new arrivals like him. The place was run with military precision, and the rules hit him fast. Wake up at 5 a.m. sharp. Finish chores before breakfast. Respect the chain of command, and absolutely no slip-ups. Ethan's hands, soft from years of city living, quickly grew calloused, hauling feed sacks and mucking stalls. The air reeked of hay sweat and animal musk, but it felt oddly grounding after months of chaos. The farmstead wasn't just about work. It was about breaking old habits and learning to show up for yourself and others. Ethan's assigned mentor, Ryan Carter, was a tough but fair presence, a guy who had once been in Ethan's shoes and now wore responsibility with quiet pride. Ryan showed Ethan the ropes, taught him tricks for calming a skittish horse, and gave pointers on splitting wood without wrecking your back. The two would talk quietly in the evenings, their boots kicked up on the porch as the sun set behind the cottonwoods. Ryan didn't preach. He just listened and let Ethan figure out his own lessons. It was a strange, unfamiliar routine, but slowly, a new sense of purpose started to take root inside Ethan, even as the work pushed him to his limits. As weeks passed at the farmstead, Ethan found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. What began as simple survival, doing what he had to so he wouldn't get kicked out, gradually shifted into a sense of genuine pride. Each morning, the once daunting list of chores started to feel less like punishment and more like building blocks for something bigger. With every horse brushed down, every row of crops tended, and every barn swept, Ethan could see and touch the progress he was making, not just in the fields, but inside himself. Ryan Carter, ever watchful but never overbearing, quietly noticed Ethan's progress and recommended him for a leadership role. For the first time, Ethan was invited to morning meetings, asked for his opinion on daily plans, and trusted to manage small groups during chores. The responsibility was both intimidating and exhilarating. Ethan knew firsthand how easy it was to lose hope in a place like this, and the thought that he might help someone else through it gave him a real sense of purpose. Earning that trust didn't erase his past, but it offered him something he'd never really known before: a place to belong and a shot at being someone worth relying on. That sense of belonging grew even stronger the day Ethan was told he'd be mentoring a new arrival, a girl named Harper Lewis. She was younger than Ethan had expected, with sharp blue eyes and a guarded expression that made it clear she was sizing everyone up, ready to fight or bolt if she sensed weakness. The staff gave Ethan her file, a history of petty theft run-ins with the law, and a stint with a street crew back in Spokane. She'd only been at the farmstead for a few hours, when Ethan met her, but he recognized the signs of someone who trusted nobody and nothing. The challenge ahead was clear: help Harper find her footing before she unraveled and make sure she didn't drag herself or anyone else back down into old habits. The first few days weren't easy. Harper hated the early mornings and chafed against every rule, her sarcasm sharp as barbed wire. Ethan, remembering his own arrival, tried patience instead of force. He started by inviting her to help him feed the livestock, using the animals as a way to bridge the silence. The goats, with their stubborn antics, and the horses, with their quiet strength, seemed to soften Harper's edges a little. Sometimes she'd crack a smile, brief, almost reluctant, when a lamb nudged her or a chicken darted between her legs. In the evenings, Ethan kept things low-key, talking about nothing much, or sharing stories about the farmstead without pushing for her trust. Little by little, Harper started showing up on time, pitching in without being asked, and even taking pride when a task was done right. Ethan recognized the slow thaw, knowing how hard-won every small victory was, mentoring. Harper wasn't about fixing her overnight. It was about offering her the kind of steady presence and belief he'd once needed himself. Through those quiet shared routines, Ethan and Harper both learned that sometimes the toughest journeys start with the smallest steps toward trust. Just when Ethan began to think Harper might actually find her footing at the farmstead, the ground shifted beneath them both. 2 weeks into her stay, on a raw, windswept Tuesday afternoon, a sheriff's cruiser crunched up the gravel driveway, an uncommon sight that sent a ripple of unease through the whole farm. Harper was out by the pasture mending a broken fence with Ethan when they saw the officers step out, hats pulled low against the wind, eyes searching. Ethan's heart skipped. He'd seen enough to know this wasn't a social call. He spotted Ryan Carter and the farm director deep in conversation with the deputies, their faces set and grave. Moments later, Ryan beckoned Ethan over with a nod, quietly breaking the news. Harper had an outstanding warrant in another county. The law had caught up with her, and they were here to take her in. Ethan was handed the impossible task. He was the one meant to tell Harper. He remembered how, at his lowest, even the mere sight of a badge would make his heart pound with dread. Now it was up to him to soften the blow. Walking back toward the pasture, Ethan rehearsed what he'd say, wishing there was a better way. He found Harper kicking at a clump of dirt, unaware of the storm about to hit. Taking a deep breath, he explained what was happening as gently as he could. The look in Harper's eyes, a flicker of fear, then disbelief, cut deeper than anything Ethan had faced since his first day at the farmstead. For a long moment, Harper just stood there in stunned silence, her hands clenched at her sides and her jaw set tight as a padlock. The world around them, the lowing cattle, the wind rattling the barn doors, seemed to fade away. Ethan could see the calculations behind her eyes: run, fight, or surrender. He recognized that look, the desperate panic of someone who thought they were finally catching a break, only to have the past claw its way back. "I'm not going back," Harper whispered, voice raw. Ethan tried to reassure her, explaining that the farm staff would vouch for her, that cooperation could mean a lighter outcome. But Harper's mind was racing. She asked what the warrant was for, and when Ethan said he didn't know the details, just that it couldn't be anything too terrible, if she truly didn't remember, it did little to comfort her. Harper kicked the ground and cursed, then stared off toward the distant tree line, as if measuring the odds of making it that far before anyone could stop her. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He told her he'd walk with her to the farmhouse, stand by her side, help her face whatever came next. For a moment, it seemed like Harper might relent. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and even managed a weak smile. But as they walked back toward the main compound, Harper lagged behind her, breathing growing quicker. Without warning, she slipped something from her jacket, a pocket knife, the blade catching a glint of gray afternoon sun. In an instant, she had the knife at Ethan's throat, her body pressed close behind her free hand gripping his shoulder. Ethan froze, the cold steel biting against his skin. He heard shouts, "Staff," then the deputies telling Harper to drop the knife. Harper, wild-eyed and shaking, yelled that she wasn't going back. Not after coming this far. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she choked out, voice trembling, but clear enough to slice through the commotion. Ethan tried to talk her down, telling her it wasn't worth it, that she still had a chance, but terror had closed in around her like a noose, and for a moment, nothing else could get through. The next moments unfolded in a haze of adrenaline and heartbreak. Ethan's mind spun with everything he wanted to say. Pleas for Harper to trust him, to let go of the knife, to give herself another chance. But his throat was pinned by the sharp edge, and his words came out in strained, pleading whispers. Around them, the compound erupted in chaos. Farm staff called out desperate warnings. Other residents kept their distance, and the sheriff's deputies fanned out, guns drawn, but hands trembling, trying to coax Harper into letting Ethan go. The air felt electric, the possibility of tragedy thick enough to taste. Ethan could feel Harper shaking, her breath hot against his ear, every muscle in her body wound tight as a spring. He kept talking, telling her she wasn't alone, that this didn't have to be the end, that whatever came next, he'd stand by her. Harper's grip faltered, and for an instant, it looked like she might drop the knife and crumble into tears. But then the realization of what she was facing seemed to hit her like a tidal wave, fear, shame, and that old bone-deep hopelessness taking over. Harper's gaze darted from Ethan to the deputies and back again. Someone shouted her name. Another called for everyone to stay back. Her knuckles whitened on the knife. "They're going to take me, Ethan. They're going to lock me up and throw away the key. I can't go back," she sobbed, her voice cracking. Ethan pleaded with her to let go, promising he would testify for her, that the people at the farmstead would speak on her behalf. He told her she was stronger than her past, that she didn't have to let fear decide everything for her. But terror pushed Harper further. She started backing away, dragging Ethan with her, edging toward the tree line, beyond the pasture, her last desperate shot at freedom. The deputies followed their commands, more urgent, their weapons now fixed on the pair. Then, in a split second that would replay in Ethan's mind for years, Harper's resolve snapped. She cried out, "I'm sorry, not to the law or to fate, but to Ethan, the one person who'd shown her trust." Her arm tensed as she moved the blade. A gunshot cracked through the cold air. Harper's body jerked, the knife clattered to the dirt, and she collapsed in a heap at Ethan's feet. The days that followed moved in slow motion for Ethan, every moment thick with disbelief and guilt. He replayed the scene over and over, Harper's desperate eyes, her shaking hands, the sharp apology that hung in the air long after the gunshot had faded. The farmstead returned to its quiet routines, but nothing felt quite the same. Staff and residents walked with heads down, a hush falling over evening meals and morning roll calls. For Ethan, the smallest reminders, a denim jacket slung over a fence post, the sight of the knife glinting in Lost and Found, brought a fresh ache to his chest. He wondered if there was something more he could have said or done, a moment where he could have reached Harper before her fear took hold. The farm staff assured him he'd done everything right, that he had risked his own safety for Harper's sake, but their words felt hollow against the weight of what had happened. In quiet moments alone in the barn or by the fields, Ethan found himself talking to Harper as if she were still there, sharing regrets, promising to carry her story with him. Through the pain, he understood a truth he'd never learned from any counselor or court. Not everyone gets to outrun their past, but everyone deserves someone who believes in them. Ethan carried that lesson into every new day, determined to be a steady hand for those who stumbled, no matter how rough the road ahead. In the shadow of tragedy, he discovered that even when hope is fragile, its presence can change a life forever. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story today. If you found it meaningful or it resonated with you in any way, please consider supporting the channel by hitting the like button, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you never miss a new video. Every subscription and share gives me more motivation to keep bringing you real, heartfelt stories just like this one. Don't hesitate to leave a comment or share your thoughts. I always look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again for being here, and I hope to see you in the next video.